touch on something that there's a lot that could be said, but let's hit some of the high points here. And that is the essay already mentioned, Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism. There's something that is somewhat problematic. Leslie briefly described how that is, and then Jason, you can comment about some thoughts there.
Really hard to describe it briefly. It's a pretty long chapter. I tried to make it accessible for people who are not biblical scholars. And I had some people read it who are not biblical scholars in advance, and they told me that they could grab it. But it is, I heard someone call it crunchy a while back. There's a lot to chew on in this material. So modern theology and biblical criticism itself has only been looked at very briefly by a couple of biblical scholars. First and foremost, Richard Bauckham published an article on it. Oh, I can't remember what the journal was, but I think the article came out in 2013. And Bauckham was slightly skeptical of what Lewis wrote. N.T. Wright has not really addressed modern theology and biblical criticism, though he has talked about mere Christianity and Lewis in general on biblical studies. And Wright is fairly critical of Lewis on biblical studies, but he hasn't addressed things at the granular level the way that I did with modern theology and biblical criticism. So I just looked up all of the things that Lewis was reading and expanded on the things that those people were reading and took little things and things that Lewis just spoke about briefly and analyzed them. And then it just opened up all kinds of really critical fundamental questions in biblical studies. So let me draw out one more. In this first bleat, Lewis is sure that the Gospel of John is not a spiritual romance or an allegory, and I believe he's correct. He is right. As far as I can tell, reading John almost 2,000 years later. But he brings up a couple of different examples to prove that it is what he calls reportage, though he interrupts himself a little bit, though no doubt has some errors. Lewis is always clear that the Bible can have errors. He knows this, but he thinks that, for example, the story of the woman caught in adultery is reportage because the narrator has Jesus scribbling on the ground in the dust. And Lewis says, if I may use this word, doodling. So I like to use the word doodling. Jesus doodling in the dust. And he said it doesn't move the story forward in any way. It doesn't have anything to do with the main point of the story. It is a little unnecessary detail. And Lewis says, no one up until the 19th century wrote fictional or wrote things that were true with little unnecessary details. And in fact, he is completely wrong here. So wrong. I see Jason nodding. So he says, if you don't believe me, go read Auerbach. So I read Auerbach, and I did not see Auerbach supporting what Lewis said. Now, Auerbach in and of himself is pretty dense too, and Lewis never specified what it was that he meant when he said, go and look at Auerbach. So I had to infer from what Lewis was saying that he was talking about these little visual, unnecessary details to add realism to a story. And in fact, this was something that was well known in the ancient world, both prior to the time of Jesus, at the time of Jesus, after the time of Jesus. It was called enargeia, and it was taught by people who taught others to write, to put in these little unnecessary details. And it didn't matter whether they were true or false. You just did it to add spice to the story, one might say. So this is one place where Lewis went wrong. And it was really puzzling to me because he returned to the idea of realism in experiment in criticism. And he says different things in experiment in criticism than he says in modern theology and biblical criticism. So it's my guess, and of course, all I've got is a guess, that after Lewis delivered modern theology and biblical criticism at Cambridge, maybe somebody came up to him and said, you know, that stuff you said about realism, about adding details that had to have happened, the author of the Gospel of John had to have seen it. Well, that's just not the case because he did not repeat it when he wrote about realism in Experiment in Criticism, which he published in 1961. And there's a lot more I could say about this, and I have the feeling that I may have gone into too much detail already.
Yeah. Jason, do you want to comment any on this?
Yeah, I think that's good on my end. I think she's explained everything well enough there. I mean, we could really nitpick on, what does Auerbach mean? I know Edith happens to think that that Lewis gets Auerbach right. I'm not 100% sure myself. Auerbach is really complicated. But I don't really have much more to add on what she just said there. So, I mean, I think that's all actually pretty straightforward.
Okay. One of the things that is not going to be part of this interview because we went on some other topics, but then we did touch on, or maybe it was mentioned that since Lewis didn't publish this, I think that was already established in what we're definitely keeping and not cutting and leaving on the edited out, is that Lewis didn't publish this in his lifetime. And in discussions, it was noted that maybe this would have been an early draft. He would have done some revising to it had he decided to publish it. And as you were noting just a moment ago, Leslie, about others may have said, challenge some points. And so that's why Lewis didn't repeat some of the details that you were noting about. But yeah, it's some things for people to check out in your book, and we hope people will definitely do that.